Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Mr. Robot Season 3, Episode 7, Fredrick and Tanya. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Mr. Robot. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Mr. Robot up to Season 3, Episode 7. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video. Otherwise, some things may be spoiled for you. So this was a pretty interesting episode. This, I think, was exactly what we needed to have after the last two episodes, which many agree are the two most epic episodes of Mr. Robot ever, as everything went down and you sort of had a really high adrenaline shot. And so I think a lot of people were noting that the episode after that had to be sort of a come down, a sort of breath of air after that. But most shows, I think, to their detriment, tend to do filler episodes, or episodes that aren't really that good afterwards. And this season is not letting up on that. It is not having a single episode that is kind of boring or filler or not good, which, again, this is turning out to be one of the best seasons of television ever. Instead, they do exactly what we need. They give us sort of retrospect, a sort of overview of the entire show, in fact, of where we're at now, how things are panning out, and actually sort of a new perspective, I should say, on what's been going down with the show, pretty much. And so let me just jump right into that, what I mean by that, because basically in season 1 we're sort of presented with the story of a hacker who has this group of hackers, and they set out, and it's sort of based off Anonymous, obviously, because they had the mask and everything, but loosely based. It's not exactly them, because they're off to do sort of almost a Fight Club type thing, where they want to bring down society, where they want to destroy, this evil corp, which, they call Evil Corp, which in this world sort of controls everything, the most powerful corporation in the world. So they want to bring down the whole economy by bringing them down, and thus create chaos in which the little guy who's often stepped on by the big guy will survive. And that's what the pretty much whole season 1 was about, this group of hackers led by this one guy who's a bit iffy, not right in the head, and it's about them bringing down the system. And then season 2 kind of got it more into what do they do now, what do we do next after we take down the economy. And that's when they start to realize, and the show starts to show that, well, this wasn't like the great fight off the oppressors, defeat the rich kind of thing that they might have thought that it was at first. And it was mainly about this hacker group and what happens afterwards, what happens next. Now, this season, particularly this episode, makes it extremely clear that that's actually not what the story was. That was the story from one perspective, and we got the perspective of White Rose hinted here and there, but the Dark Army and White Rose were always presented as in season 1, they were this other group that the F Society, our group of hackers, needed help from in order to pull off this grand, massive scale. And they were known as this, powerful, sort of very shady hacker group. In fact, some people within F Society were very iffy about using their assistant, but basically Elliot and the others admitted that they needed to. There was no way they could pull it off without their help, because otherwise the E-Corp backup systems would just go to China. So they needed to have this other hacker group based in China that would be able to prevent that from happening. And so they were presented as a necessary evil, as an uneasy ally. And since then, they've grown more and more prominence, whereas I think in season 3, pretty much the entire show is about the Dark Army now, and its leader, White Rose. And so what this episode makes very clear is that the whole thing was White Rose's idea in the first place. Like, it might have been Elliot's idea in the first place, F Society or whatever, but White Rose sort of confiscated that, sort of used that, took that for her own purposes, and the whole, 5-9 hack basically was her idea, and used it because it benefited her, allowed her to have this UN convention where they could annex Congo, which is what she really wanted to happen. So it was all the purpose of that. And then since then, she's been using Elliot, who thinks it's all about his robot. He's still, or I should say Mr. Robot more. Elliot kind of woken up that it was a bad idea, but Mr. Robot's personality of him is still 100% convinced that this is revolution for the people. And this was a sort of groundbreaking episode in that regard. I almost see this like, if you think of the whole series, apparently there's a 5-year plan, so it's meant to be 5 years long. And if you think of this is in that terms, this is pretty much the halfway point of the show. I would even say the turning point of the show. It's slightly more than the middle of the 3rd season, so it's slightly closer to the end than it is the beginning, but still, it's, in terms of storytelling, this is the turning point. I think where everything is going to become different from now on. Now, this is a very, very bleak episode. I should also point that out, and that's also due to after the ending of last week's episode, where this massive terrorist attack taking place. It's pretty, that's appropriate for it to be bleak, but I think it gets even more bleak. And so one watching this episode may think that everyone's fucked, everyone's screwed, White Rose has everything under control, and this is based because we learn, basically, this is all White Rose's plan. Pretty much everything we've seen up to this point, with a few tinier exceptions I'll get into here and there, was all her pulling, she's the puppet master and everyone else was the puppets singing to her tunes, which, I don't know, it was hinted at throughout the course of the series, but it was made crystal clear in this episode, particularly with her conversation with Price. And the reason why I say this is a turning point is because in order for, and I'm kind of making assumptions here, but in order for any sort of narrative arc or story going forward, we need to move beyond. I think this is the point where it's made crystal clear that this was all White Rose manipulating things, and we need to start moving towards a resistance, a break in that. And I think Dom DePiro represents our biggest character to lead that resistance, and of course Mr. Robot Elliot is going to evolve to a new situation. So I think, I think now the story is going to have to, in order to move forward, it has to evolve to not only explaining more of White Rose's master plan, but of her starting to lose a bit of control. Because up to this point, basically, she's been controlling absolutely everything, and I think that is why this episode is so bleak. And I do think we get hints in this episode of this new power dynamic starting to spring up and become. So let me jump right into it. Another sort of interesting thing about this episode, and a unique thing I should say, is that Elliot barely appears in this episode. Like at the very start, like we see how he's freaked out over, traumatized over these attacks, but he disappears into Mr. Robot rather quickly. But even then, we don't get much Mr. Robot in this episode either. So it's really, this episode does focus a lot more on the Dark Army, White Rose, and her whole sort of reach there. Now, we do focus a bit on Fredrick and Tanya, which I'll get to shortly, but I found really interesting the Elliot stuff, because he goes straight to Krista, which makes a lot of sense, because he was totally freaked out and traumatized by this event, so he goes to her for guidance. Now, what's interesting is he starts, and again, it is great production where you start to fragment. You hear a lot of static noise that goes when he keeps repeating over and over again, I don't know if I can tell you, I don't know if I can tell you. I actually thought when I was watching this that he was getting resistance from Mr. Robot, who didn't want him to tell her what their actual involvement is, because Krista is one of the few people in the show, like not even White Rose knows this, that Elliot has a split personality and he's between Elliot and Mr. Robot. Well, what Krista's disadvantage has always been up to this point is she didn't know about that, the hacking, the F Society, the 5/9 hack, the Phase 2, all that. She's completely ignorant of it. So it completely changes the dynamic. that she now knows. And it's interesting to me that Mr. Robot is the one who tells her, because I had assumed Mr. Robot was the one fighting Elliot, telling her. And it's curious why he told her. I'm not exactly sure why. I think it's mainly because he simply didn't care. Maybe because he knew that he needed her as a go-between between him and Elliot, because he wants to communicate, but for some reason they're not talking to each other, so he wants to sort of move past the hurdle of her trying to guess at what's really happening and just be like, look, this is what's really happening. And I love how, of course, it made sense that she didn't believe him at first, because he is insane after all. He's got split personalities, so it's very natural for her to assume that he has delusions of grandeur. And I love how Mr. Robot was like, oh, you're just handling me like one of your crazy, nutso patients. But you are one of her crazy nutso patients, so it makes sense for her to handle him like that. But I love how, he just sat down and he said, look, just, put all the pieces together. Think about this. This is, what's happening and blah. And he worked it all safe and starting to put everything in place for her. And I think she had. I think she did. She thought about this logically and thought, holy shit, this makes perfect. Especially like all of Elliot's earlier rants about fuck society and all that. It fits in line with this thinking. I don't think she just... it makes sense that she would never put two and two together, because it is a sort of a grand sort of thing to think. But I think once, Mr. Robot confronted her like that, she did put two and two together and is completely convinced. And so in the next scene, we see her go to her lawyer, who advised her not. He said, oh, thank God you went to me first instead of telling anyone, because you're just going to get yourself, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose all credibility, and this guy is probably just another nutso taking credit for something he didn't do. So even though she knows, I don't think she's convinced that he didn't do it. I think she knows that he did it. But she also knows that she's not going to be able to convince anyone of this otherwise. Other than the fact, because outside of her, we watching the show know that the FBI is already aware that Elliot was involved in this. So even if she did go to someone, she wouldn't be telling them anything that they didn't already know. So that's interesting to think about. So I think this is going to set up a really interesting dynamic between her and Elliot and Mr. Robot from now on. I think she's going to continue to work with him with the knowledge of that, and that's going to give her more knowledge, more power, and therefore more involvement, more ways to affect what's actually going on. And she's going to realize she just can't go to the authorities about this, that she's going to have to continue to treat Elliot, but with this knowledge in mind, which I can't wait for. I think this is going to be set up a really interesting dynamic. And also, now I have to talk about the dynamic between Elliot and Mr. Robot. Especially, now let me get in the scene with Mr. Robot where he goes to Irving, and Irving basically sets a trap, and the Dark Army guys in masks come on and beat him over the head, and he takes him to this really rich party where he's doing his, cleaner, the wolf from Pulp Fiction sort of thing, where he's going to take care of this dead body who overdosed at a rich party or whatever, and nobody cares at the party. And he uses that as a metaphor. It's like, look, those are the people who they wanted the 5-9 to happen. They used it for their benefit. And I think during Mr. Robot's tirade to Krista earlier, he even said that my work for, to free the people got corrupted by the rich or whatever. But I think when Irving took him to that party, he realized that his work was corrupted from the beginning. It's not like it just happened just then, just with Tyrell. He was being played from the very get-go, like I said, from the start of season 1. Now, this is what's going to set up an interesting dynamic now that Mr. Robot knows this. Because Elliot had already been convinced, since... Well, I don't know about since season 2, but definitely since season 3. I think even since season 2, that the 5-9 hack was a horrible idea and it caused more harm than good. Mr. Robot, on the other hand, was still 100% gung-ho, on board with this. This is our revolution. This is what we need to do. But now's the moment where he realizes that he was being used. It was all wrong. It's not helping the people. It's hurting them. So this is going to set up a really interesting dynamic between Mr. Robot and Elliot, and I think it's going to align them. In fact, I wouldn't be too surprised if they actually were able to start talking to each other again soon, because they're going to be more on the same page now. And that's why I think Krista is going to be very essential to bringing these two halves together. And now that she knows what's really going on, she's actually going to be able to be more helpful in that regard. Elliot is, of course, completely shell-shocked about the LA persona, I should say, about what just happened, and Mr. Robot isn't, but I think, so they're both sort of in panic mode, so I think it's setting up a dynamic where these two are going to come together, and it's going to I think it's going to completely change Mr. Robot. I think Mr. Robot's he's not going to be working with the Dark Army anymore. It's going to completely change the dynamics. It does make me wonder why Irving was so blunt with him, though, because why not just kill Elliot at this point if they don't need him anymore, because obviously they're not going to get his help by saying something like that, so it did make me very curious, but maybe they'll explain this more down the line. So now let me get to Mobley and Trenton, or Fredrick and Tanya, as they're referred to. And this is something interesting, because when I was watching this episode, I kind of just assumed that the post-credit scene in season 2 was that this scenes were taking place like a couple of weeks or months, because we know, like, between season 2 and season 3 we got a lot of hints and stuff about time jumps, so it's been a couple of months at least. So I had assumed that this was a couple of months, and Leon was just sort of hanging out in the desert keeping tabs on them during this time. But I watched another sort of podcast, and they sort of pointed something out that actually makes a hell of a lot more sense, is that the post-credit scene from season 2 was actually sort of a flash forward. It was out of linear time. It was actually taking place during the time of this episode, and or right before it. So it was actually a jump forward in time, which I didn't even consider, but that makes a hell of a lot more sense. We do know that the scenes with them in this episode are in sync with this, Elliot's timeline, because we see the bombing of all the E-Corp, 71 E-Corp buildings, so that anchors it at the same time period, so we know there's no time to place displacement there. So I think the time displacement came with the post-credit scene. But again, you have to love Leon, where he's, talking about his sitcoms. He starts out by just talking, last year it was all about Seinfeld, and in the flashback they mentioned something about Mad About You, and how he watched that before Seinfeld, but then apparently he started watching Frasier, and he was off-put by sitcoms because it was unbelievable that some balding old white dude would get as much tail as that guy does, which is funny. I watch Frasier occasionally. I never watch it regularly, but I don't remember him getting that much tail, to be honest. I don't know, maybe I didn't watch enough, but regardless, it was fun and joking. He talked about how he moved on to Knight Rider, and of course, which I actually hadn't seen, well, since I was old enough to remember anyway, so I can't really comment on Knight Rider, but it's funny how they use that as the opening credits. The Mr. Robot opening credits are always great and stylized, but that was his new thing. Trenton and Mobley were sitting there fearing for their lives, of course, asking reasonable questions like, are you going to kill us? Please don't kill us. And he's just babbling on about Knight Rider. I don't know, something about that. And plus, I don't know, I had mixed feelings about the humor, because on the one hand, they had these humor scenes with Mobley and Trenton, how they're stuck, and she was like, saying, you're not even Jewish, what are you doing on Jew date? And, how she breaks out, but she can't even drive, and she crashes the car. I don't know, I found that a bit contrived. I mean, they were in an open desert with only a few rocks around. I mean, you have to be a pretty freaking bad driver to slam into the rock. And I know that she was in a panic, and the guy, Mobley, told her to floor it, so she may be going too fast, but still, I don't know. And it's also Leon's reaction to that when he's just like, God damn, like not even freaking out when he saw them driving away, and for all he knew, they could have drove away and left him stranded there in the desert where he'd likely die, and his reaction was still going, God damn. And then, so he's kind of similar to Irving in that sort of carefree, sort of style or whatever. But and it's interesting that he didn't sort of punish them too much for doing that. He made them dig instead of him digging, was apparently the punishment for that. And he seemed to sort of build a rapport with them. Now, the reason why I said I was kind of iffy about the humor is because it was kind of funny in that moment, but the dark tone at the end of the episode where you do realize that the Dark Army is going to kill them and set them up to be patsies, basically. So everyone's going to think they're huge terrorists that killed thousands and thousands of people. And then force them, like have the guys, like just en masse, force him to hold a gun up to his head. Of course, they do that for, logistics and the FBI investigation, so it looks to them like he actually held the gun up against his head like he shot himself. This is really, really dark, so it makes me think maybe the humor is kind of, I don't know, in bad taste almost. It's kind of too sort of jarring with how richly, like, depressing that scene was. Although it made much sense. And the way the scene was filmed, it was sort of in conjunction with the Peru stuff when the FBI were raiding the house. It was very sort of high tension. I love the music. But I knew that the FBI wasn't going to. I heard some people say they were fooled. They thought the FBI was going to come in time to save them. I knew that wasn't the case. I didn't know specifically that it was taking place in two different time frames, like the Mobley stuff was taking place before the FBI charging, but I actually thought that it was a different location, that they would burst in and be like, oh, it's a different house that looks the same. But no, it was two times for same exact thing, but I kind of got the sense from the way it was that scene was constructed that we were being tricked, that that wasn't really what's going to happen. So I wasn't too surprised when they actually turned up dead. It was super, super depressing, but also, all fits in with White Rose setting up Iran to be the scapegoat. They put up all these Iranian flags and stuff, and it's too. And this was explained in a line, actually, I think, during the White Rose scene when White Rose was talking to some random guy before Price stepped up to him, and he said something about how world conflict is always very profitable. So this explains why he's setting up Iran. Because if you think about it, all these wars, Afghan war, Iraq war, arguably, were the result of 9/11. They certainly wouldn't have as much support as they did if it wasn't for 9/11. So it's very logical to assume that there could be some sort of wars or conflicts that derive out of this terrorist attack, especially against Iran, and that's why White Rose is setting up Iran as a scapegoat, because world conflict is profitable, and that's why he's doing it, which is pretty disturbing. And I'll get into the Price stuff later, but that's also super. This episode was really disturbing, but that's not to say it was bad. But back to Mobley and Trenton. Something I've watched a couple podcasts where the people seem to forget. This little detail is actually quite important, is when they were in the caddy and Trenton was trying to get loose, Trenton mentioned that she had the email that had all the information, because they mentioned this in the post-credit scene in season 2, that she had a plan to undo the 5/9 hack. And Mobley actually assumed, because she wanted to send it to the FBI, he assumed that she did. And she was like, no, I didn't, but I have it in the backup. If I don't get back there in a few hours, it's going to automatically send it to someone I trust. So, some people forget that. That means that this will come, not maybe, I think most definitely will come into play later on. Like, some people were thinking, oh, well, that whole scene about them saying that she had a plan to undo the 5-9 hack and take them down. Well, that's completely pointless now. There was no reason for that. It didn't need to be there. It was a red herring. No, it was not a red herring. It will come into play later on because that line was purposely sit there. And I love how it was kind of like just thrown in there subtly, so you might be able to miss it, which apparently some people did. This will come into play. And also, like, another thing I think some people miss is that they thought maybe this email would just tell them that Trenton and Mobley weren't actually the ones responsible for these terrorist attacks. But that's not all it will say. It will say that as well, but also it will be instructions to undo the 5-9 hack, which basically, stage 2 sort of finalized that by killing all the paper records. But what this program would do would be to unleash the digital records, which are said to be lost forever, like an encryption that can never be found. But this is a way to undo that, which would change everything. Not only would it prove that Mobley and Trenton were set up, but also it could undo everything that White Rose has accomplished, basically. So this is not a line thrown in there for shits and giggles. This is definitely going to affect things down the line. Now, who this trusted person was that Trenton was talking about, I don't know. I tend to think it's a character that we haven't met yet, and it's going to be a new. I almost got the impression that it was going to be the season 4 character, so this wouldn't be touched on and resolved until season 4, just like they did with Irving. They'll introduce a new character in season 4. Hopefully, this new hacker person who will have all the information to take down White Rose, basically. Or maybe she sent it to her family, was another thought that I had, which would be less boring, or more boring, less interesting, I should say, because they don't really have any computer hacking skills, so they wouldn't really know what to do with it. But the other thought I had is maybe she sent it to Dom DePiro. I don't know. They never actually met before, so she wouldn't be someone she trusts. Maybe she meant trust because she researched her and she knew that she wasn't bought out by the Dark Army and she knew she could be trusted. Maybe that's what she meant. I don't know. I kind of doubt that one. The possibility I think is most likely is a character we haven't met yet. But whatever it is, I think this most certainly is going to be a factor down the line. So now let me move over to talk about Dom DePiro, because I've mentioned earlier about how I think she's sort of the great white hope here. She is the shining hope that the only one, or the main one, I should say, not only because there's Elliot and Mr. Robot, who some would argue is more important, but who could really stand against White Rose, because she's totally not buying any of this, like the whole setup. And this shows, like, I still think we spent way too much time with her in season 2. We didn't need to see her masturbating and talking to her freaking robot machine. But it is good that we got to know her in season 2, because we do know that she is smart enough to see through this bullshit. That she's smart enough to know, and she's close enough to this to know that something's going on, that things aren't what they appear, that this is obviously a setup. Now, I'm still unclear on whether or not she's aware of that Santiago is dirty and that he's bought by the Dark Army. I don't think she is. I think it's possible she could suspect, but I think she needs a lot more evidence, a lot more she has to suspect it by now, because she's smart in the way that he's actively fighting her every single time she goes anywhere near the Dark Army of White Rose. She has to suspect. And the fact that he wasn't there during the shooting. So she must at least suspect it, but I don't think it's any more than the suspicion. She needs a lot more than that. And I think that's her biggest hurdle going forward, is that she needs to know definitively that he is working with the Dark Army, because at the moment, even up to this point, she treats him like she's not. She takes all of her information to him, because that's the way chain of command should work, but she, by doing so, is undermining herself. and that's why she's not able to do anything, because she has this direct superior who's working directly opposed to her. So the first hurdle that she needs to overcome is to learn. Not necessarily, she doesn't have to turn him in or kill him or anything like that. She just needs to know that he can be trusted and be aware that he's working with the Dark Army. So I do hope that happens soon, and she must suspect it heavily by the end of this episode, because she knows that everything she just witnessed is bullshit. And this is the other thing, is because she interviewed Mobley in the season 2. And again, she's smart. She's a smart detective. She's a smart investigator. She's smart enough to know that he was not responsible for this, that he's being used as a patsy, that he would not... I mean, she's smart enough to read that he was a nervous, scared little hacker who thought he was doing right by 5/9 hack, to think that he was like this huge terrorist working with Iran to blow up buildings. She knows that's bullshit. She can sense it. And I think that's great. And so it's interesting. It sets up a sort of a possible thorn in this grand master plan. So I can't wait to see this explored more. So let's talk let's talk about Angela. Now, I've watched a couple of videos where people are taking the scenes in this episode with Angela to mean that the whole time travel stuff was just a red herring. There's going to be no time travel. It was basically White Rose lying to Angela, because alright, so actually I'm going to start with the scene with White Rose and Price, because that's when White Rose explains that Angela was actually the key component, and I wasn't very clear on this. And in fact, this explains the whole thing about why Price took on the pet Angela's, or his pet project, at the end of season 1 during season 2, because this is something that really puzzled me. It puzzled Angela. She couldn't figure out why Price, and she kept hounding him, why are you taking so much interest? And he would tell her bullshit, which she could see through and see obvious it was bullshit. But here we crystal clear see is because, well, she knew it was because she was going after the town plan, but he wasn't really stopping her, and that was the confusing part to her. But we find out he wasn't stopping her as a way to fuck with White Rose. And it was sort of a power play that he had with White Rose, that because he knew that White Rose wanted that power plant so badly, so he was basically taking on, trying to manipulate her for his own purposes. And then White Rose saw that and got pissed, so she took Angela directly and started manipulating her for her purposes. So that leaves many to believe that the whole time travel stuff is nonsense. Especially the way we see Angela act in this episode. It's obviously that the elevator's not going to the top floor. She's a couple of tacos short of a meal. I don't know the any more of the stupid idioms, but basically she's not all there. And like the way she was like rewinding, see, they're okay, and we just play and rewind. Now they're safe again. So and a lot of people combined with that with what White Rose said, basically implying that she just manipulated Angela, and so the implication here is that she lied. There's no time travel. There's no taking things back. She just made some shit up to Angela to make her anything to get Angela on her side. I don't know. I'll put it this way. I'm not completely discounting the possibility of time travel. I think the whole thing is so vague at this stage. I think it's too early, because this could in fact be misdirection, that the time travel was misdirection. And in fact, maybe time travel actually is a thing. It's just different than what Angela thinks. Or maybe, I don't know. Because we still haven't seen what exactly White Rose showed Angela to make her such a believer. We still haven't seen the exact thing. Until we know that, I'm going to reserve judgment of whether or not this time travel thing is bullshit. I'm sort of leaning towards that it's kind of similar to time travel, and we got the hint of parallel universe earlier in the episode, but it's different than what Angela thinks it is, but it's still something very strange. Because we do know that White Rose needed this plant. She referred to it as her plant, and we get more information about that in this episode too, is because basically that scene between White Rose and Price implies that she knew from the beginning that it was her plant. That's what White Rose said. This was my plant, and she even talked about Price's predecessor. So basically, she put Price in place as the CEO of E Corp, and before Price, it was another person. Apparently, didn't do what he was supposed to, in order to protect her plant, her one plant. Now, why is that plant important? Why is it her plant? Why is it so important that nothing go wrong with it? And then, is it just a coincidence that Elliot's father and Angela's mother died at this plant? No, it's not a coincidence. Was that benefactor that Angela's mother's lawyer was telling her about, was that actually White Rose? Maybe. I think it's not a coincidence that those deaths occurred and that Elliot's now involved. And White Rose even talked about this one stage, about how Elliot's father was responsible for creating something or something. So it's all involved. And I think somewhere down the line, maybe not this season, but somewhere down the line, a flashback episode is coming that takes place entirely in the 90s with the older characters that explains what the hell is going on. So this is a whole thing coming from the beginning. So my whole point is that there's still the mystery of what White Rose's plan is. What's so special? We still have no idea what's so special. So I think it's too early to rule out time travel. Very well could be. Could be to parallel universe. Could be something that's not even so science fiction-y, something a bit more realistic. Something. But there's still a big chunk of the mystery, and I think it's too early to discount anything at this stage. But we do know from this episode that she's moving the plant to the Congo, which was her backup plan. So how that can affect things going forward. Is she done with E Corp now? Because she doesn't need them, because now she's going to move the plant to Congo. What does that mean for Elliot? What does that mean for Angela? How come White Rose didn't kill Angela? Because she said, like, oh, after stage 2 we won't. Basically, I don't know if she specifically said stage 2, but she did say, "Oh, we're going to kill her when we don't need her anymore." So we do know Angela is being lied to an extent if it's White Rose's plan to kill her. And I certainly don't think that White Rose's plan is to bring all the people who died in those attacks back to life like Angela does. And she's, as I said, not there at all. And I think, because I was saying before, I was wondering how Angela would respond to the fact that she was completely and totally lied to. And now we have the answer. She goes crazy. She can't process it. She can't compute, and so she's just gone off the freaking deep end. So I don't know if it's going to be a permanent state of affairs or if she's going to snap out of it at one point. And of course we see Darlene sitting with her in house. Darlene going to treat her, because Darlene has to, she has to work with Dom, because I think at the moment Dom's biggest resource is Darlene, because Darlene, as soon as she finds out about Mobley and Trenton, she knows full well that that's total horseshit. The whole Iranian connection is total horseshit, and Darlene can prove this wrong. So I think that Dom's going to work with her, but Dom knows that she's keeping something from her, and what she's keeping from her is Angela was involved. So is Darlene going to give Angela up? She kind of has to, in order to gain Dom's trust, which desperately needs at this point. They both need each other, to be honest. And it also brings me up the question why the Dark Army hasn't killed Darlene. If Darlene, they know that she can prove them wrong about the whole Iranian connection, or at least maybe not prove, but at least be a hindrance. So it's also curious why they're keeping her alive. So do hope that's explored further as well. But yeah, so that scene, I already talked about it a bit, but the scene with Price and White Rose, very, very interesting. I think, because it proved that White Rose, the whole entire thing was White Rose plans. She had their fingers in everything. And and the way, Price was all pissed off, was you got everything you wanted, why'd you go after me anyway? And she said, well, because I had to ask you twice. this is like maybe one of the worst villains in TV shows. This is like the most evil villain I could think of, and B.D. Wong does such an amazing job of playing her. You know, I mentioned this in the last couple episodes, but this is one evil motherfucker. This is like the evil of the evil, so I think she is going to be sort of the main mastermind villain going forward that they need to take down. Oh my god! But but it's interesting. I think like White Rose has ordered Price to quit or resign or whatever, and so the scene is kind of implying that he's beat, he's done for. I wouldn't discount him quite yet. Like I said, there's like a couple of elements out in the wind. There's Dom, who's on to White Rose. There's Angela, who knows that something's not wrong. There's Mr. Robot, who's finally starting to learn that he's on the wrong side. And I think Price is another. Oh, and then there's the Trenton, the email that she sent that's damning evidence. Price is another element. He might be combined with one of these other elements because he's going to do. He's an convicted man. He's not the type of man, I think, who's just going to roll over and take it. Even though his options are very limited, especially at the moment. But he's going to use any means possible to strike back at White Rose. Any means possible. And I think I wouldn't discount him yet. I think he might be combined with one of these other elements that's going to strike out and try to take everything down. Interesting stuff going forward. So, let me briefly touch on Tyrell. I was a bit unclear. I think someone made a comment in my last video actually pointed this out to me. And it turned out totally being the case of what happened at the end of the last episode, what his instructions were. And apparently his instructions were to do exactly what he did, to pretend that he was being held captive the whole time against his will, and he went up to yell to stop the attacks. He was being insincere. The whole attacks were his idea. And he was there to point out, to blame Mobley and Trenton, and this was corroborated by the fake of society guy that we saw. And that also explains why he was arrested, so they could have these two seemingly separate and totally individual people have nothing to do with each other, both point the finger at the same people, but when in fact they aren't completely separate and individual. It's a coordinated frame done by White Rose Dark Army, and they're both working for the Dark Army. So again, it's interesting that they're keeping Tyrell alive, but I think they needed him alive at this stage in order to point the finger at Mobley and Trenton. But then, of course, we get the scene where Santiago finally breaks it to him that his wife is dead. This is something I was wondering if he knew. Apparently he didn't know. And Santiago is basically saying, if you, tell them about me, if you do anything to her, then not only are we going to kill you faster than you can blink, but we're also going to make sure that your son is going to be a statistic in the system. Now, interesting thought I had is Santiago is like, I'll make it my personal mission in life to make sure your son is a statistic. But if Tyrell outs Santiago and exposes him, then he won't be able to make it as a mission in life to to turn the son into Willie, because he'll be in prison. So, and I mean, maybe they could make do with the second part of the threat of killing him, but maybe Tyrell doesn't care about that since his wife is dead. Something to think about. Anyway, so my rating for Fredrick and Tanya out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. This was a richly dark episode, a slow episode, but a great episode, a retrospective, to put everything into perspective, and it does an amazing job at doing so. I love how we barely get any Elliot or Mr. Robot, and we don't actually focus on any one particular character or storyline. We go back between all of the other, between Price and Mobley and Trenton and Angela and all of them. And as in Dom, we get a lot of Dom in this episode too, but she wasn't the focus. So really good halfway point, I would call it. even though it's technically not halfway point. It's episode 7, but I think it's halfway point of the entire series, and we're going to see this new dynamic going forward. So it's going to be really interesting. I'm really excited to see where this leads. And it was a pretty good episode in its own right. So that's it for my review of Fredrick and Tanya. Be sure to check back here as I continue to review episodes of Mr. Robot. Also be sure to check out my channel as I do many other videos and other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.